In the quiet hollow of Shallowick County, Virginia, surrounded by pine thickets and sugar maples that haven't known pruning since the Jackson presidency, there sits the ruins of a chapel that no longer opens its doors, yet still rings its bell. Not every night, only in early September just after dusk when the shadows stretch longer than they should. The locals don't touch it. The diocese won't claim it. The state has no record of its construction, but it's there. Stone walls blackened with time, steeple sagging under weight, not fully architectural, and pews still bolted to the warped floor inside. The church has no official name, but the few who still speak of it call it Nine-Wake Chapel. It is a name spoken reluctantly, as if saying it too loudly might stir the echoes, as if, beneath the decay, the building still remembers what it was made to hold. The land it sits on belonged once to the Gallatin Parish, an offshoot congregation of the larger Saint-École. Si, ne, Gorowan Circuitoy. In early 1841, it was granted limited oversight by Father Reginald Druin, a priest known less for orthodoxy than for his tolerance of border faiths, a blend of Anglican rite and folk ritual common in the mountainous fringes of Virginia. The chapel was built in haste, using volunteer labor and timber hauled from the Wicklow Grove. It opened in the spring with little ceremony, but by fall, it had become the center of a growing whisper, a shadow over the county that began, as most do, with a single death. A boy named Nathan Crowder, age 11, died suddenly of fever in late August. The attending physician noted nothing unusual, except that the boy's mouth remained open, as if mid-sentence, and could not be closed. Father Druin agreed to perform the funeral, but when the day came, the coffin was light. No one opened it. No one asked to. The boy's mother, dazed, said only that he had been taken clean and that he was no longer in need of burial. That night, the first hymn was heard, not from within the chapel, but from beneath it. A low, lilting chant, like dozens of voices just out of harmony. No one had stayed behind to sing. The church had been locked. The hymns stopped at dawn. The following night, another funeral. This time, an old widow named Martha Delbry, said to have succumbed to the same fever. Again, the casket remained sealed. Again, it was light. Again, the voices returned. But now, they were joined by something else. A bell tolling from the steeple. No one had pulled the rope. The door was bolted from the outside. Yet it rang 9 times. This continued for a full week. Each night, a death. Each morning, a funeral. And each funeral, a sealed coffin with no weight. The hymns grew louder. The bell rang clearer. By the 9th night, crowds had stopped gathering. People stayed inside, curtains drawn. But the chapel held its final funeral alone. No mourners, no pallbearers. Just a priest, one casket, and a building that seemed to sing by memory. After that, no more deaths, no more processions. But the bell did not stop. It rang once more the following September, and it has rung every year since. The man who officiated all 9 funerals, Father Reginald Druin, was never officially sanctioned by the Diocese of Richmond. His ordination papers were incomplete, signed not by the bishop, but by a missionary deacon from Tennessee whose own records remain lost. By the time Druin arrived in Shallowick County in 1838, he was already known as a strange fixture in border parishes, a man who could quote Latin scripture backward and name every psalm by its harmonic root. Locals described him as stern but gentle, with pale gray eyes and a tendency to stop speaking mid-sentence as though listening to something only he could hear. He carried no Bible, only a worn leather-bound book whose title had long since rubbed away. It was from this book, witnesses say, that he read during the 9 nights. Not the Book of Common Prayer, not the King James, but something older, rhythmic, and never repeated. He never kept a journal. No homilies survived. But in 1874, a surveyor mapping the old Gallatin parcels discovered a ledger hidden beneath the chapel altar, tucked in the hollow of a broken communion rail. It contained a list, hand-scrawled in red ink, of 9 names. Next to each, a date, and next to the final entry, an unfamiliar symbol, a circle split by 2 vertical lines. That ledger is now kept in the State Historical Archive under restricted access, but a photograph was leaked in 1997. Linguists and theologians attempted translation, but the symbol appears in no recognized theological or occult system. The only match? A chalk drawing found on a crypt wall in Belgium from 1721, marked beneath the phrase Nox non terminatur, the night does not end. More troubling was a marginal note on the 9th entry, scrawled hastily in the ledger's gutter: no body, no spirit, held in sound. That phrase became a focal point of later inquiries. Was Druin performing funerals or containing something? Was the rite a farewell or a lock? There are other hints. In the margins of the ledger, several musical notations appear. Not lyrics, but notes written in a key no longer used in modern worship. Musicologists later identified them as a disassembled hymn, constructed to be sung in layers. If performed correctly, each note would echo another, forming a continuous cycle of unresolved sound, a loop, a prison made of harmony. And it was this music, not the sermons, not the rites, that the chapel remembered. Decades after the funerals, hikers passing the site reported hearing partial hymns, always broken, always just short of completing the phrase. Some said it sounded like children, others like women singing underwater, but all agreed it never finished. And at the center of it, the echo, the hum, the bell, stood Druin's chapel, rotting but intact, as if the structure itself had absorbed the ritual and refused to decay until its work was complete. In the years following the final funeral at Ninewake Chapel, the site was quietly absorbed into obscurity. No further deaths were recorded under the parish's name. No official decrees were issued. It simply stopped being used. But the building remained untouched, unclaimed, and yet strangely preserved by time, as if the forest hesitated to reclaim it, or worse, as if the soil itself resisted decay. Between 1842 and 1865, only a handful of mentions of the chapel surface in public record. A tax ledger from 1847 lists the land under the category inactive religious use. A missionary's letter in 1853 describes the structure as closed by unspoken agreement. But the most chilling document comes from a surveyor's assistant named Doyle Carow, who had been hired in 1861 to map several derelict properties ahead of a proposed railroad line. Carow was in his late 20s at the time, trained in mathematics, but deeply religious. He kept meticulous field notes. His log from the day he reached the chapel is preserved in the Shallowick Township Historical Museum. It reads, "Arrived at the chapel site just before dusk. Sun low, light slanting. Walls intact but bowed. Doors shut tight, nailed from outside. Windows cloudy, though unbroken. Air still. Then, just before I could measure the steeple's base, I heard it. Music, not loud, not joyful. A slow sound as though someone were humming into a bottle. Felt it behind the ears, beneath the ground. My horse pulled against the reins. I turned, intending to sketch the outline. When I looked again, the door was ajar. Carow did not go inside. He left immediately. His final line is scrawled, almost an afterthought. I was not alone. I felt counted. That last word, counted, has sparked debate among folklorists, spiritual historians, and even mathematicians. Counted by whom or for what? What does it mean to feel numbered by something that makes no sound but song? After Caro's report, the railroad plans were abandoned. Officially, it was blamed on swampy terrain and unstable limestone. Unofficially, several workers had refused to enter the grove near the chapel after hearing soft knocking from the trees. One man claimed he saw a procession of men in black walking toward the chapel, but when he blinked, they were gone. No footprints, no movement, just stillness. Between 1870 and 1900, Nine Wake Chapel entered its folkloric phase. Children were dared to approach it on the 1st of September. None reached the door. Parents told stories of empty caskets that still shifted at night. A midwife named Elsie Trout, who lived 2 miles from the site, claimed to hear voices from her well every autumn, always male, always in harmony, always ending in a name she didn't recognize. In 1894, an amateur photographer named Benson Krellick attempted to document the chapel. He arrived with a large plate camera and 2 assistants. According to his surviving letters, they spent the afternoon taking exterior photos and prepared for an interior shoot at dusk. The first few images were unremarkable: door, bell, windows. But as the sun set, something shifted. The camera began jamming. Plates cracked on their own, and Krellick's assistant, a man named Harding, fell unconscious in the doorway. When he woke, he spoke a full sentence in Latin, despite having no knowledge of the language. The priest who translated it years later identified the phrase as, "We are not yet sung through." The phrase appears nowhere else in scripture. The images Krellick took that day, the ones that survived, show the chapel bathed in dusky light. But in one frame, the final shot before the plates failed, a faint figure stands just inside the doorway. No face, no movement, just a black cassock, like those worn by funeral bearers in the 1840s, and a hand resting on the inside of the open chapel door. Some believed it was Krellick's shadow. Others noticed the proportions were wrong. Too tall, shoulders too narrow. Krellick never returned. He left photography within the year. His final note on the chapel reads, "It isn't haunted. It's waiting." In the decades that followed, other attempts to reclaim or demolish the chapel all failed. In 1911, the land was purchased by a local council hoping to convert it into a war memorial. The papers were signed, the survey complete. But when workers arrived to clear the area, the site could not be located. They wandered for hours within the marked grove, but found no structure. That night, all 9 members of the planning committee reported the same dream: a candlelit aisle, an organ playing from beneath the floor, and a boy with no mouth handing them a program for a funeral. Each program listed a different name, and every name belonged to someone who had died the following year. The memorial was never built. The land was quietly returned to private hands, and the chapel inexplicably reappeared the following spring, visible once again. In 1939, a folklore archivist named Mary Austin conducted a brief field interview with an elderly woman known locally as Miss Thelma, who had lived her entire life less than a mile from the chapel grounds. When asked about the building, Miss Thelma simply said, "It ain't dead. It remembers what it was told." She described hearing the bell ring every September 9th at the same hour, 9:09 p.m., not before, not after, and always 9 tolls. She said one year she tried to wait inside the chapel to hear it ring from within, but when the 9th bell struck, she felt something crawling in her chest. Not an insect, but a name. She couldn't say it. She never tried again. The archivist asked what she believed the chapel really was. Miss Thelma's answer was quiet, almost ashamed. A voice that never finished its song. That description has endured in the oral tradition, a structure not haunted, but unresolved. A funeral that never ended. A course that was left open, It is this sense of suspension, of interruption, that defines Ninewake Chapel. Not terror, not even grief, but a music that has no last note, and the fear that if we ever hear it finished, it will not end in silence, but in something far worse, understanding, the kind that cannot be forgotten, the kind that makes you realize the bell that rings in September is not calling the dead. It is marking the living, reminding us that we are being counted too, and one day, when the harmony is ready, it will be our name echoing from the pew. By the 1950s, Ninewake Chapel had faded from official memory, but its legend lingered in the Appalachian oral tradition, not as a ghost story, but as a cautionary song. The phrase, "Don't finish the hymn," became local shorthand for stopping short of forbidden knowledge, a generational warning with no clear origin, but a feeling everyone seemed to share. That silence might be safer than certainty. The hymns themselves had become the focus of academic curiosity. In 1958, a liturgical musicologist named Dr. Edwin Poulton from the University of Virginia began compiling regional variants of Appalachian worship songs for a private archive. During a field visit to Shallowick County, he was handed an unlabeled wax cylinder recording by a retired pastor who insisted it was taken from inside Ninewake. The recording, dated 1912, had never been published. The pastor claimed it was captured accidentally by a phonograph technician surveying acoustics for a nearby Masonic hall. He had ventured into the chapel just after dusk. The bell had rung before he entered, but the inside was silent. No one else was present. He placed the stylus to the wax and let it run for 4 minutes. When he returned to play it back, the chapel was still silent, but the cylinder wasn't. What Poulton heard on that recording would later fracture his academic career and shatter his personal life. The first 90 seconds were nothing but room tone, ambient quiet, wooden groans, the faint hum of insects. Then, from nowhere, a single low tone, like a bowed organ pipe, emerged. Slowly, it was joined by another, then another, not in harmony, but in tension. The notes twisted around each other, forming something that resembled a melody but never resolved. There were no voices, only the sound of wind breathing through broken reeds, as if the building itself had lungs and knew how to exhale music. Poulton was transfixed. He transcribed what he could, noting odd time signatures and tunings that didn't conform to Western scales. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "This is not a hymn. This is a lattice of tones built to hold something still." Over the next 6 months, Poulton became consumed. He reconstructed the melody on piano, layering in what he called phantom inversions, notes he claimed he could hear but weren't present in the recording. His wife described him as distant, forgetful, prone to muttering in his sleep. He spoke often of the harmonic door. Then, on a Tuesday in early January 1959, Poulton invited a small circle of colleagues to a demonstration. He said he had finished the composition and intended to play it in full. The gathering took place in his study. The piano had been tuned precisely. A reel-to-reel tape was prepared to record. Poulton sat at the keys and began. What followed, according to the transcript made afterward, lasted exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds. The melody began slow with the low bowed tones from the cylinder. Then came the dissonant layering, 12 notes across 5 octaves, played not as chords but as overlapping threads. At 2 minutes in, one witness reported feeling a drop in temperature. Another noted a smell like wet stone. At 3 minutes, the light in the room dimmed slightly. No bulb burned out, just a general lessening. At 3 minutes and 30 seconds, Poulton struck the final sequence, and then everything stopped. The tape recorder continued to run, but no sound was captured past that point. The notes were gone. The piano, though visibly played, produced no tone. Poulton sat motionless for 10 full seconds before closing the lid and standing. His expression was blank. When asked if he was all right, he replied only, "The last note didn't belong to me." He never played the piece again. He destroyed his notes, burned the transcriptions, and retired from the university within the year. In his final public statement, he wrote, "There are songs that end, and there are songs that wait." This was one of the latter, and I fear I let it hear itself too clearly. He died in 1963 under undisclosed circumstances. His widow claimed he began whispering in his sleep during the final months, not words, but melodies, notes without pitch, a sound that made no sound. The original cylinder, presumed destroyed, resurfaced in 1986 among the estate of a deceased sound archivist. Attempts to digitize it failed. Every attempt, analog or digital, returned blank playback, as if the wax remembered it had been heard once and refused to be heard again. Since then, multiple attempts have been made to replicate the melody through theoretical models and vocal ensemble reconstructions. All have failed to complete the cycle. One choral director claimed that whenever they approached the final measures, their singers lost pitch, tempo, or focus, as if the music unlearned itself in real time. But the pattern persists, the same set of notes, always breaking at the ninth phrase, always stopping just short of naming something. One theologian speculated that the music itself is the missing body, the ninth soul that was never buried. The sound, then, is not a hymn, but a resonance of the unlaid dead. And if that's true, then the chapel's bell, which continues to ring every September 9th at 9:09, may not be sounding a memory, but marking time until the song can finish. And what happens when it does? What wakes when the echo becomes whole again? That question remains unanswered. And in Shallowick County, no one is in a hurry to find out. The chapel remains untouched, the doors still nailed shut. But those who pass close enough in September swear the melody is clearer now, stronger. As if the structure's tuning itself, as if something inside it has started to remember the last note, and all it needs now is someone willing to sing it. In 1996, the Virginia Historical Preservation Initiative, working in partnership with the National Endowment for the Humanities, approved a grant to identify and document unregistered religious structures predating the Civil War. The effort was part of a broader cultural recovery project aimed at preserving rural history before it vanished entirely into forest and folklore. Nine Wake Chapel was on the list, barely. Its exact coordinates had been misfiled under a decommissioned postal route, and no official parish had claimed ownership in over a century. But its stone frame and distinct bell tower, barely visible through satellite imaging, caught the attention of Dr. Lucinda Wren, an architectural historian known for uncovering postbellum churches lost in the Appalachian stretch. Dr. Wren visited the site in September with a small team of graduate researchers, expecting nothing more than a ruined chapel and perhaps some faded ledgers. She brought cameras, surveying gear, and structural safety tools, but within 24 hours, she would file an emergency cessation order and request that the chapel be redacted from the recovery list. Her notes from the trip remain sealed by the historical board, but a scanned copy was anonymously published on an academic forum in 2004. It was a personal journal, not meant for review, but it reveals more than any official record. The first entry is dated September 6th, 3 days before the chapel's infamous bell date. She writes, "The building is here, somehow smaller than I imagined, yet it seems to sit beneath the trees as if they were grown around it like ribs. Structure sound, stone cool, no scent of rot, no birds nearby, very quiet, almost reverent." On September 7th, her notes take a shift. We marked the perimeter, mapping doors, windows, foundation lines. Discovered something strange. The eastern wall measures longer on the inside than the outside. We triple-checked. 16 feet exterior, 19 feet interior. No false wall, no visual break. It's not a trick of angle. Somehow, the interior has more room than the exterior allows. It's impossible, but it's there. On September 8th, the team attempted entry. The main door was sealed shut with rusted nails and a thick oak beam warped into place from moisture and age. Still, Wren's team noted that the chapel was colder inside than the exterior air should allow. They placed thermometers at the windows. One graduate student, Malcolm, swore he saw movement inside when the sun hit the glass just right. Not a person, but the shadow of a pew shifting slightly, as though someone had stood up and stepped away. That same night, at precisely 9:09 p.m., the bell rang. All 9 tolls, evenly spaced. The team had no access to the interior rope. They assumed it was atmospheric, wind, gravity, a mechanical slip. But the next morning, they found the rope wet, as if freshly handled. The building was otherwise undisturbed. On September 9th, Wren wrote her final entry. "We are pulling out. Something is wrong with the air. It feels enclosed, like we're being listened to." Malcolm left last night, refused to stay past the 9th toll. He claimed he heard his own voice singing from inside the chapel, a melody he didn't know, in a key he'd never heard, but somehow recognized. He packed and left without a word. The others are quiet. No one will speak above a whisper. We're leaving today. No photos, no measurements, no sound. The team returned to Charlottesville without samples. Dr. Wren submitted her withdrawal recommendation with one line scratched into the margin. It is not meant to be opened. It is meant to be remembered. Her career survived, but she never again participated in fieldwork. She died in 2012 after a long period of aphasia, a neurological condition that gradually robbed her of speech. In her final weeks, nurses noted that she often hummed tunelessly in her sleep, a sound described by one orderly as unpleasantly incomplete. Since the aborted restoration, no further physical attempts have been made to breach Nine Wake. The site is now geo-fenced by state forestry law, under the obscure designation of a passive religious ruin, a term coined to satisfy both historians and church officials without assigning responsibility to either. Yet each September, the bell still rings, sometimes a little earlier, sometimes a little later, but always 9 times, always at nightfall. Locals still gather at a distance, never approaching closer than the old iron boundary fence that rusts in place like a warning line. They stand in silence, heads down. Some say it's respect, others say it's recognition. That hearing the bell once is enough to bind you to the count. That each year you return, you bring the chapel one name closer to completion. What happens? When the count finishes, no one knows. But in 1999, a letter arrived anonymously at the Shallowick Historical Society. It contained no greeting, no return address, only a line written in slanted ink, reading, "The bell is not a call, it is a measure. And the sound it makes is not echo. It is the space left for the last name." Attached to the letter was a list, 8 names, no context, no dates, all believed to be people who had died the same month they visited the chapel. The 9th space was left blank. The implication was never confirmed, but in town, no one questions it anymore. They know the pattern, they hear the song, and no one steps past the fence. Because the chapel is not a ruin, it is a sealed sentence, a sentence that is missing only one word. And if you say that word, or bring it with you, or even just come too close to thinking you know it, the chapel will ring your name into the silence, and it will never stop listening for your footsteps again. In 2003, a high school senior named Caleb Werner from nearby Essex County submitted a documentary film project titled Sanctified Dust: Forgotten Churches of Southern Virginia. The assignment was part of an advanced placement media class, and his plan was modest: explore and document a few abandoned religious sites and interview locals for oral history. What began as a creative effort for a college application would become the last known public footage of Ninewake Chapel before its image vanished again, not just from view, but from record. Werner, 17, was a diligent student, but not religious. He had heard about the chapel only once, from an old gas station attendant in Shallowick, who, when asked about any old chapels still standing, answered, "There's one still counting." Werner pressed, and the man scribbled a rough set of directions on a receipt. Don't knock. Don't answer. And if the bell rings, don't record the 9th toll. The footage that emerged from Caleb's camera, originally shot on mini DV tape, is now the subject of both digital folklore and legal suppression. His original edit was uploaded to a school-hosted webpage on October 5th, 2003. It remained online for 7 hours. Then it was pulled. By whom? No one knows. Not the teacher, not the school, not the hosting provider. Requests for logs returned blank fields. But the video had already been seen. Roughly 90 students watched the full 11-minute film before it vanished. Only fragments remain in grainy screen recordings and low-resolution reposts. But what those pieces show is haunting in its banality. Werner never entered the chapel. He stood at the boundary fence and zoomed in. His narration is calm, unsensational. He lists the date of construction, references the fever deaths of 1841, and reads a local quote, "A chapel that sings itself empty." Then, around minute 4, the camera shakes. The microphone picks up what sounds like a low hum. Not wind, not machinery, but a vocal vibration. Werner doesn't react. He continues speaking, seemingly unaware. But the hum builds. The trees sway without wind. Dust floats visibly in the sunbeam, but the shadows remain perfectly still. The most jarring moment comes near the end. In frame, the chapel door, which had remained shut, is seen partially open. No sound, no creak, no movement, just open. One frame later, it's closed again. No edit, no cut, just gone. Students who saw the original claimed that during the final 2 minutes, the audio warped. The bell rang 9 times, but each toll reversed itself, echoing before the strike, as if time had been recorded backward, as if the sound knew it was being heard and attempted to fold itself into silence. Caleb Werner never finished the project. His final grade was marked incomplete. 1 month after the upload, he was withdrawn from school. His parents cited a medical sabbatical, but his friends recall something stranger. Caleb had begun attending funerals of people he'd never met. He would stand at the back, silent, dressed in black, always alone. When asked why, he'd say only, "I was invited." In January 2004, Caleb was found standing outside the boundary fence of Ninewake Chapel. It was midnight, no car nearby. The temperature was below freezing. He was barefoot. In his hand was a paper program from a funeral that had never taken place. 9 names were listed, 8 with full names. The 9th was marked only with the phrase, "The one who watches." Caleb was taken into care and never returned to school. He now lives in assisted housing under a pseudonym, known to speak in musical tones and respond only when addressed with the phrase, "Hymn complete." His footage has never been re-uploaded by him, but each year, in early October, someone posts a single frame from the original, usually on obscure forums or unlisted video sites. It shows the chapel in profile, bell tower framed by leafless trees, and a faint white line stretching from the steeple to the edge of the sky. Some claim it's a wire, others say it's a crack in the image, but a few believe it's something else. A thread, barely visible, still unbroken, stretching into whatever silence the chapel was built to hold. After Werner's footage, official entities distanced themselves from the chapel entirely. The Diocese of Richmond released a rare statement that read simply, "We have no record of that structure, we decline comment." The Virginia Historical Initiative closed its rural project a year early, citing budget constraints. And in 2005, the land surrounding the chapel was reclassified not as historical, but as private ecclesiastical domain, a legal designation with no modern precedent. No name was assigned, no group took credit. It was as though the land itself had written its own deed. Since then, all attempts to film, photograph, or document Ninewake Chapel have ended in either corrupted media or inexplicable interference. Equipment fails, files vanish, GPS coordinates reset, and for the few who try anyway, something worse happens. The feeling that the chapel has already recorded you, that it doesn't need to be seen because it has already seen you. In digital circles, Werner's video is now known as the ninth tape. It's cited alongside other so-called cursed media, videos that erase themselves, songs that distort memory, images that seem to change when unobserved. But Ninewake stands apart because unlike the others, it doesn't show you anything. It waits, and when you come close enough, it plays you something in return. Something incomplete. Something still waiting for its final verse. And once you've heard it, even briefly, the silence you return to no longer feels silent. It feels unfinished, as if a note is still ringing. Somewhere behind the trees, somewhere beneath the chapel's broken bell, somewhere inside you. In early autumn of 2011, a minor paranormal investigation series called Threshold Appalachia set its sights on Ninewake Chapel. The crew, led by host and producer Greg Lenton, had filmed over a dozen episodes on haunted barns, abandoned mine towns, and derelict Civil War hospitals throughout the region. Their format was sensational but standard. Arrive after sunset, place EMF detectors, conduct interviews with local witnesses, and capture what they could on infrared. Up to that point, their show had more skeptics than believers, but their cinematography was polished and their ratings were solid. They had heard of Ninewake only in passing, as a dead spot, often mentioned on local forums with warnings rather than coordinates. But a volunteer named Cora Bell, a sound tech from Culpeper, convinced the team it would be worth pursuing. She had grown up hearing the chapel's story from her grandmother, who told her never to whistle after September 9th. Cora claimed that her cousin had once tried to spend the night on the property and came back unable to hear anything but singing for a month. Greg, ever the showman, saw potential in the legend. The chapel hadn't been formally investigated. No one had filmed it with modern tech, and if the bell really did ring, capturing it live would make for an unbeatable episode. The team arrived on September 8th, planning to camp just outside the perimeter and film through the night, catching the supposed tolling at 9:09 p.m. They brought full-spectrum cameras, ambient microphones, thermal sensors, and backup batteries. None of it would make it to air. Their episode was never released. What happened that night became the final shoot of the series. The crew never filmed together again. The recovered audio log from Cora's lapel mic, found buried in the archive of a university server, provides the only surviving account of the night. It begins normally, quiet banter, equipment checks, wine brushing over microphones. Around 8:45 p.m., Greg's voice is heard, noting a weird energy dip on the handheld EMF monitor. It's faint, and the team jokes about faulty wiring. But at 8:56, something changes. Cora whispers, "Do you hear that?" No one responds for several seconds. Then the mic picks up a low harmonic pulse, like the tuning of a bowed instrument under the earth. At 9:01, the team notes a strange draft. Not cold, but thick. Like walking into steam, but dry. The cameras glitch. Static fills the feed. At exactly 9:09, the first bell rings. The sound is not metallic, but organic, as if struck from within the stone itself. It echoes flat and low, not above them, but through the ground beneath. The ninth toll never comes. After the eighth, there is silence. Then, softly in the background, an unfamiliar hymn begins. No words, just voices, layered, too many to count. At first, they sound distant, like a recording played through fog. But as the minutes pass, they grow clearer and closer. Panic begins to spread. Greg's voice rises. "Do you hear your name?" The others deny it. Then a scream. The audio peaks. There's running, crashing. The mic cuts in and out. In the final recorded seconds, Cora is alone. Her breath is rapid. She says, "Something opened the door. I didn't see it open, but it's wider now. I think it's waiting for me to finish the song." Then, silence. Then, a sound not like any human voice. A resonance that knocks against the ears, not with volume, but weight. The audio ends. That was the last time Cora Bell was heard from. The team searched for her for hours, refusing to enter the chapel. Police were called. A formal search followed. No body. No signs of struggle. No prints. Just her recording gear, neatly coiled beside the chapel steps. Her lapel mic, still warm. The official report lists her as missing. Her mother insists she isn't. She claims she still hears Cora's voice humming behind the walls of her house at night. Not in any song she remembers, but in a note that never ends. Greg Lenton never filmed again. He deleted the show's archive, dissolved the production company, and relocated to Oregon under a different name. In a single email to the show's fan forum before it shut down, he wrote only, "We didn't film a ghost. We filmed a need. And when you see it, it sees you too." Since then, the area surrounding Ninewake has been quietly fenced off by state order, though no agency will claim ownership. Motion sensors were installed but mysteriously disabled within the first year. Game cameras fail to record inside a quarter-mile radius. Digital corruption, glitches, flat black frames. But occasionally, between garbled clips, a pattern emerges. A sequence of stills that align across different camera devices, all showing the same image. A doorway, slightly open, with a faint light just beyond the threshold. Not a warm glow, not candlelight, but something colder. The glow of unfinished attention. A choir with mouths open, waiting for a voice that hasn't joined yet, waiting for the song to conclude. But the final singer, it seems, is always the one watching. And Ninewake watches everyone. In 1927, decades before Ninewake Chapel became a whispered taboo, a man named Walter Greaves attempted to do something few had even considered: finish the chapel's music. Greaves, then 41, was a choir director and amateur composer based in rural Virginia, known locally for reintroducing pre-Civil War hymns to small-town congregations. A self-taught musicologist with a fascination for lost harmonics, Greaves was also drawn to what he called suspended cadences, musical phrases that seemed to be reaching for a resolution that never arrived. He believed such phrases carried something spiritual, that they opened a doorway of sorts. According to his journals, Greaves stumbled upon the name Ninewake in a footnote from an 1873 Methodist hymnal. It referenced a disbanded chapel in Shallowick County of noted unburied tones. Curious, he made a trip to the overgrown region that fall and found the chapel. Sealed, silent and surrounded by what he called air that presses. He brought no camera, no measuring instruments, only a tuning fork, which he struck just outside the rotted gate. He recorded the reverberation on paper as a D diminished, with anomalous overtones at intervals that resist Western notation. Greaves became obsessed. Over the course of 9 months, he reconstructed what he believed was the unfinished hymn of Ninewake, using scraps of oral history, harmonic resonances noted in the soil, and his own intuition. The resulting composition was titled Requiem in Silence, Chapel 9. It was never published, but it was performed once. The performance was held in Holliston Hall, a modest auditorium in Richmond, and featured 9 singers from Greaves's community ensemble. It was scheduled for a private showing, no more than 40 attendees, mostly other choir directors and clergy. There are only 2 surviving programs from that night. One is housed in the Richmond archives, handwritten in calligraphy. The other was found tucked into the lining of Greaves's coat after his death. It lists a simple progression: Prelude in minor, Psalm response, Chapel 9. Eyewitnesses recall that the first 2 pieces passed without incident, but as the choir began Chapel 9, a heaviness entered the air. One attendee described it as a pressing from within the ears, like water waiting to rush in. The piece began slow, dissonant, almost off-key, and yet precisely rehearsed. The audience sat quietly as the notes climbed, merged, then diverged again. Around the 5th minute, things began to unravel. One singer stepped back and covered her mouth, refusing to continue. Another began to weep without realizing. Still, the choir pressed on, voices vibrating against each other in strange, throaty waves. The conductor, Greaves himself, appeared entranced, swaying with increasing fervor. At minute 8, a low tone entered the room. It did not come from the singers. It came from the walls. The air took on a hum. Floorboards trembled. A chair leg cracked. One guest later swore they heard a man's name whispered directly into their left ear, a name they did not recognize, but which matched someone in their family who would die that same winter. The music reached a final crescendo, not loud, but absolute. And then, just before what should have been the closing chord, Greaves collapsed. The singers stopped mid-note. Silence followed. Complete. Suffocating. No applause. No movement. Just the sense that something had started to step through. Greaves was revived after 15 minutes, but he refused to speak. He never again conducted. He burned all known copies of Chapel 9 save for the manuscript buried in his coat. His journal after the event contains a single page. We reached the door, but it opened inward, and I believe something looked back. In the months that followed, 3 of the 9 choir members reported auditory hallucinations. One began compulsively humming at night. Another fell into prolonged silence, refusing to speak again. A third, a baritone named Ellis Camden, went missing entirely during a church retreat in the Shenandoah Valley. His bunk was found empty, his shoes neatly placed by the river. In their place was a folded page of sheet music containing the last phrase of Chapel 9, but written backward. The notes did not match any known key, but when placed under spectral analysis by a modern researcher decades later, they aligned precisely with the same warped frequencies recorded in the chapel's legendary tolls. Since then, Chapel 9 has become a point of fascination among fringe musical theorists and forbidden composition forums. It is rarely discussed in public. No full recording exists. Only scattered vocal renditions, each one cut short, corrupted, or abandoned before the final note. One notable attempt in 1984 by a private European choral society ended mid-performance when 5 of the 9 singers suffered severe nosebleeds. The conductor, who had no prior health issues, collapsed and later described a deep voice beneath the ground telling me not to finish. All attempts to digitize the composition into MIDI files have failed. The files erase themselves or loop infinitely without closing the sequence. One theorist described it not as music, but as a harmonic container, something built not to be sung, but to hold what should never escape. Greaves's legacy, while obscure, remains etched in the memory of those who witnessed the performance. Several continued their careers in sacred music, but refused to perform any piece in an odd time signature thereafter. They claimed certain rhythms create space, and in space, things wait. Today, Chapel 9 is considered unperformable by most, not because of its technical difficulty, but because it finishes something, and no one knows what comes after. It is now believed by some that Greaves didn't compose the piece, he remembered it, or worse, that the chapel gave it to him. And what the chapel gives, it never gives completely. It always keeps the final note for itself, not as a gift, but as a claim. The first recorded disappearance near Ninewake Chapel occurred on September 9th, 1893. A farmhand named Elias Dern, 24, was last seen walking his mule cart down a logging road less than 2 miles from the old chapel grounds. His family described him as reliable, level-headed, not one for stories or shadows. The cart returned empty, the mule unharmed, but Elias was never found. That same night, neighbors reported hearing a church bell ringing faintly, despite no churches in that direction for several miles. Authorities chalked it up to poor visibility, wild dogs, and the density of the woods. The case was closed without resolution, but every few years after, a new case would echo the same pattern, always in early September, always a single person, and always within the vague orbit of Ninewake's forgotten boundary. Most of the victims were ordinary: a postmaster, a piano instructor, a cemetery groundskeeper, a boy delivering telegrams on his bicycle. In some cases, footprints led toward the woods and simply stopped. In others, journals were found with cryptic final entries. "I heard my name in a song with no words," or "It's waiting for me to listen back." But in all cases, the bodies were never recovered. There was nothing to bury. And in every case, the same detail recurred: the ringing of a bell, not loud, not near, just present, distant enough to question, close enough to follow. By 1939, a retired archivist named Merritt Holloway began compiling a private log of what he termed the Ninth Ones, a reference to the idea that the chapel had performed 8 completed funerals, and that the 9th was always missing. Holloway, a deeply religious man with a background in liturgical geometry and old ecclesiastical maps, believed that Ninewake was not a church in the traditional sense, but a spatial reliquary designed to hold unclean transitions. Not quite death, he wrote, but not quite life either. A holding space for what the rites cannot cleanse. He mapped the disappearances, noting that while the victims came from different counties, their last known locations formed a slow inward spiral, like an unthreading coil, tightening toward the chapel itself. He estimated that if the pattern held, the spiral would complete by the early 2000s, with the 9th ring overlapping the structure. "When the names circle the chapel," he wrote, "the chapel will answer back." Holloway died in 1944 of a stroke, mid-sentence, while writing what would have been the final chapter of his journal. The last line ended, "And should the bell ever ring once without an echo?" The pen trailed off the page. His notes were inherited by a former student, who later claimed they were not written in ink, but in powdered graphite, and that they smudged even when kept in airtight conditions. The student burned them in 1972, but copies, typed, partial, and incomplete, began to surface on underground theology forums in the early days of the internet. There, the list of ninth ones expanded. Unofficial entries were added. A hitchhiker last seen near a foggy ridgeline, a woman who vanished from a closed-door wake, a musician whose last voicemail was a humming tune with no discernible melody. The most recent name to join the list was Aaron Solis, a cartography graduate student at James Madison University. In 2015, Aaron submitted a project titled Acoustic Cartography of Abandoned Structures in Tidewater, Virginia, in which he attempted to visualize architecture through recorded sound rather than blueprints. Her submission included an unmarked waveform labeled simply Structure X. The sound was low, broken, but unmistakably rhythmic. Pulses of static that, when analyzed, revealed a time code. It was 9 minutes and 9 seconds long. Her professor, intrigued, asked about its source. Aaron refused to answer. Her roommate reported that Aaron had recently become obsessed with a location somewhere west of Route 39, where she claimed the air bent sound into shapes. On September 9th, 2015, Aaron left her dorm at 5:42 p.m. to go finish something. Her last phone ping was recorded 2 hours later at a remote patch of woods near the forgotten edge of Shallowick County. Her car was found parked. Her phone lay in the passenger seat. The engine was cold. The radio was on, softly playing a single sustained note. A canvas bag in the back seat contained blank sheet music, a recorder, and a printed map with a circle around an unnamed field. The circle was drawn in red. Just beneath it, written in her handwriting, were 3 words: "It still listens." She was never found. In total, there are now 8 confirmed cases, with the 9th always looming, always just short of being named. Local folklore claims this is by design, that the chapel doesn't want to finish its 9th funeral. It wants to sustain it, that it must always have one name hovering, half-spoken, neither mourned nor remembered. Because to bury all 9 would be to complete the rite. And once completed, the hymn ends. And once it ends, whatever it was holding would no longer be bound by unresolved cadence. It would become whole. The sound would finish itself. And what sound finishes itself in a chapel that no one built, with rites no one wrote, and sermons that read backward through the soul? Interestingly, no one on the 9th one's list has any known burial site, no grave, no headstone, not even a cenotaph. And in the rare cases where families tried to hold symbolic services, the services were interrupted. Weather, sudden illness, inexplicable structural damage to the chapel or home. One coffin cracked from within before the service began. Another was found unsealed with a hollow indent, as if something had once been inside but vanished upward. A third floated in its burial vault for 3 days, refusing to sink despite being sealed in cement. Every time the name was spoken aloud, something resisted, and so the dead remain unnamed, unfinished, sustained. Today, a few whisper of a coming 9th, not tied to the chapel's history, but to its future, someone yet to enter, yet to be claimed, yet to be folded into the hymn, because the chapel is not done ringing. And each year, as the 9th of September approaches, the air near 9 Wake changes again. The ground does not shake, the wind does not blow, but the silence hums, and the silence, after all this time, is starting to remember your name. There is no record of 9 Wake Chapel ever being built, no land deed, no contractor, no cornerstone laid in ceremony. The earliest mention of the structure appears not in county archives or parish ledgers, but in a private letter dated February 1841, written by a local magistrate named Jonas Redley to his cousin in Pennsylvania. The letter, now preserved in the Virginia State Library under Special Collections, reads, "A stone house has appeared to us. It was not here last spring, I swear it. Yet the stones are weathered, the mortar dark, the wood swollen with age. It sits in the grove like it always belonged, as though the trees grew around it to keep it hidden from men who would ask where it came from. No one here built it, and yet it stands." At first, historians believed Redley was referring to a plantation chapel, a common structure in the antebellum South. But no plantation matched the location. No slaves were assigned to the build. No family claimed it as their own. Yet by March of 1841, funerals were already being held inside. The local parish, based 5 miles east in Old Shallowick, acknowledged the services, 9 of them, but refused to send clergy. A bishop's handwritten note, still archived, states, "That house is not anointed. It was never blessed, and those buried in name alone should remain as such. We do not walk where the bell rings itself." The most puzzling artifact tied to Nine Wake's foundation is a floor plan recovered in 1911 by a surveyor cataloging abandoned religious structures. The diagram is etched into a single sheet of slate, not parchment or paper. The lines are mathematically perfect, laser straight, geometrically sound, but inscribed by hand. In the lower corner is a single word, threnody, a lament, a funeral song. The date carved beneath reads simply, "Before." No year, no signature, no location. The structure it depicts is unmistakably Nine Wake, down to the half-spiral bell stairwell, the pew layout, and the inner sanctum with no visible entry point. But what disturbs researchers is that the measurements don't make sense. The interior exceeds the exterior by roughly 3 feet in all directions, a violation of spatial logic. Some speculate that the inner chamber was built as a sonic loop, using architectural pressure points to create sustained tones. Others argue it's a trick of measurement, but a few believe the blueprint wasn't a design at all. It was a recording of something found, not made, not constructed, just discovered. The chapel's bell, its most iconic feature, is made from an alloy not native to the region. Metallurgical tests performed on a chipped fragment in 1957 revealed a composition of tin, lead, and an unidentified trace element that emits low-frequency vibrations under certain humidity conditions. The fragment was returned to a private collector, but attempts to melt it down failed. The metal simply would not liquefy. It darkened, cracked, but held its shape. A note attached to the lab report read, "The material seems to resist forgetting. It is believed that the bell tolls not from wind, gravity, or rope, but from acoustic memory, that it doesn't ring for us, but for itself, keeping count, not of funerals, but of something older, something waiting to be completed." In 1989, a religious historian named Father Benton Mears, then a young seminarian from Boston, traveled to Shallowick to investigate the chapel's origins firsthand. He spent 3 days interviewing locals, studying topographical maps, and reviewing soil samples. On the 4th day, he visited the chapel. He never crossed the threshold. He respected the local warnings, but he stood close enough to observe something that troubled him deeply. He wrote, "The structure is not seated on the earth. It rests, yes, but does not root. No foundational sinking, no ground disruption. It simply exists. I've seen dug chapels, grounded ones, even elevated reliquaries. But this was placed, like an object laid onto a table. No architecture I know behaves like that." He returned to Boston shaken and left the priesthood within the year. In a letter to a former mentor, he described a recurring dream that plagued him after the visit. "I hear a hymn, but I am singing it, and I do not know the words. Then I see the floor plan again, but from above. Only now I realize it is not a chapel. It is a keyhole, and I am what it unlocks. Other records from the 19th century are similarly vague. An 1847 census log lists a meeting house on the forest's edge, but provides no congregation count. A freight manifest from 1853 mentions a delivery of 16 crates marked sanctuary materials, all bound for a location with no address, just the word return. The crates were never recovered, and a traveling preacher's journal from 1860, discovered in the wall of a burned-out church, describes a stop near the stone chapel that sings itself. His final entry ends mid-sentence, "They do not grieve like us, they wait." The most compelling theory about the chapel's origin is not architectural but musical. Some scholars believe that Ninewake was never meant to be seen, only heard, that it is not a church in the traditional sense, but a harmonic chamber designed to hold unfinished lament, that its spatial anomalies, its unbuilt foundation, and its resisting materials are not accidents, but components of a larger construct. A funeral still unfolding, one without end, one that requires a name and a note and a listener, because the chapel doesn't change, it doesn't age, erode, or settle. It just waits, as if it's still listening for the builder to return, as if the person who made it never left, or worse, never finished building. Because the chapel, in its silence, feels interrupted, and every toll, every lost name, every failed funeral might not be the chapel's doing, it might be its plea. The chapel does cast a shadow, but not the one it should. Visitors across different decades, from Civil War scouts to modern-day researchers, have noted that Ninewake's silhouette never aligns with the position of the sun. At first, this anomaly was dismissed as exaggeration, an illusion caused by the dense forest canopy or the sloping land. But reports began to gather. A pattern emerged. On bright mornings, the shadow would stretch east instead of west. At high noon, it would shift slightly, not to the north or south, but inward, curling toward the chapel's bell tower like a dark hand reaching for its own wrist. Photographs taken between 1919 and 1976 show the same angle of distortion, even when the time of day and season differ. Amateur investigators who tried to track the anomaly using compass and string found that no fixed angle could be measured. The line of shadow moved, not with the light, but with presence. When no one was near, it faded. When a person approached the chapel, the shadow lengthened, reaching toward them, never quite touching. It stopped just short. Always. In 1973, a retired cartographer named Evelyn Marrow undertook an obsessive personal project to map the chapel's shadow line. Marrow, once employed by the U.S. Geological Survey, had developed a rare condition in her later years: aphantasia, the inability to form mental images. She described her inner world as silent, blank, utterly without shape. In her own words, "I cannot see when I close my eyes, so I draw to make memory visible." After reading about Ninewake in a faded journal from a religious historian, she traveled alone to Shallowick and set up camp near the chapel for 7 days in September, sketching its silhouette at hourly intervals. The resulting diagrams, 168 of them, now reside in a sealed drawer in the Library of Congress under restricted access. A graduate student who viewed the collection described them as not wrong, but inverted. In her notes, Evelyn wrote that the chapel cast multiple shadows, each one visible only under a different mental state: wakefulness, drowsiness, fever, fear. She claimed that by sketching in sync with her pulse, she could catch the shadow that pointed to the source. On the final day, her sketches stop. The last page is blank, save for a single line at the bottom. It's not the chapel that casts the shadow. It's the shadow that holds the chapel in place. Evelyn returned home, stopped speaking, and spent the remaining 7 years of her life in a silent care facility where she drew only one shape again and again, a bent triangle with no base, pointing downward into nothing. Years later, in 1998, an astrophysicist named Dr. Lionel Graves attempted a mathematical simulation of the chapel's shadow using satellite imagery and solar angle modeling. But when he overlaid the data, he found a disruption in the standard sun path curve. The region around Ninewake created a negative projection, as if the light avoided the structure. He dubbed the effect a photonic vacuum, a space not of darkness, but of unread light. The photons didn't stop. They simply failed to register. The simulation became unstable. Files corrupted. Dr. Graves, once a tenured professor at the University of Virginia, quietly resigned and published one final article in a fringe journal titled Structures That Refuse Position. In it, he proposed that Ninewake was not anchored in its own time, that it existed across several frames of solar reference, and the shadow we see is not cast by now, but by something yet to arrive. He ended the paper with a chilling postulate. Perhaps the chapel casts no shadow until you are close enough for it to cast yours first. Some locals still speak of the chapel's silhouette in hushed tones. Children raised in the area were warned never to walk in front of it after sunset. Old maps show paths that curve deliberately wide, avoiding the chapel by unnatural margins. Hunters report that deer won't cross the tree line near its western face, where the shadow tends to stretch longest. A former land surveyor from the 1960s once recalled trying to stake a line across the property. But each morning, the stake had moved. Not far. Just enough. As if it had been nudged gently by a hand that did not want to be seen but refused to let go. What makes the chapel's shadow uniquely unsettling is that it never changes length, whether it is dawn, dusk, or midday. The stretch remains identical, 10 feet 4 inches, a precise measure. But no known source for this number exists in scripture, architecture, or music theory. Some believe it matches the dimensions of a casket. Others suggest it's the length of a single breath held for 9 seconds before being released. One musical historian argued it corresponds to the decay time of a final choral note sung at a certain frequency in a stone chamber. But in truth, no one knows. The number repeats, but it explains nothing. Only that the shadow seems to remember. In recent years, drone photography has failed to capture the shadow altogether. The structure appears normal from above, but live observers insist the shadow is visible from the ground, just not on camera. This has given rise to the idea that the chapel requires a witness to project, that it cannot be studied in isolation, that it needs the human gaze to produce reflection, a terrifying notion, because it suggests the chapel doesn't just watch you, it watches with you, and what it sees in your shadow, it might keep. There is no mechanism inside Ninewake Chapel to explain the bell, no rope, no pulley, no ladder to reach it. The bell tower is sealed from within by warped beams and centuries of time-bloated stone. Yet every September 9th, without fail, a single bell tone rings out, faint but undeniable, at precisely 9:09 p.m. Not every local hears it, not every year, but the ones who do remember it forever. It's not loud, not metallic, more like a vibration through bone. Those who've stood near the chapel say it sounds like a note struck inside your chest, one that doesn't pass through your ears so much as claim your memory, rewriting a moment you thought you lived alone. People have described it as an ache, a summons, a name spoken backward in slow thunder. Some say it makes their hands go numb. Others feel nothing at all until the next morning, when they find their own name written in the dirt near their doorstep, curved in looping script that isn't theirs and always vanishes by noon. Local authorities have never officially acknowledged the bell, but from 1984 to 2002, a strange pattern emerged in the county's emergency call logs. Every September 9th between 9 and 10 p.m., a spike in non-specific disturbances was reported. Heart palpitations, disorientation, panic attacks, sudden dissociation. In almost all cases, the person had been either near the chapel that day or had recently spoken the word "nine-wake" aloud. In one disturbing case, a child called 911 at 9:14 p.m., saying, "My brother is singing the same song over and over. He won't stop. He's not blinking." When responders arrived, the boy was unresponsive, standing motionless at the edge of the woods, mouth parted in the shape of a vowel no one could place. When finally coaxed out of it, he repeated one sentence. "She said there's no body, only the song." The bell never rings twice, always once, always one note, but it is not always heard by just one person. In 1993, during an attempted nighttime service held by a fringe religious sect, all 11 attendees claimed to hear different notes. One heard a minor third, another a perfect fifth. One insisted it was not a pitch, but a voice, not a scream or a whisper, but the sound of deciding. They scattered before midnight. One woman later admitted she heard her name in it, not the name she was given, but the one her grandmother used in secret, one never written or spoken in public. The following week, she disappeared. Her bathtub was found full of soil. Her wedding dress lay folded at the foot of the bed. A single piece of paper rested on her pillow with a hymn stanza she had written herself, ending with, "And still the chapel waits for me to ring back." The pattern doesn't stop with sound. Electrical disturbances are common within a 10-mile radius on September 9th. Radios tune to dead frequencies, picking up whispers or partial melodies no one can trace. Older televisions flash static even when unplugged. Digital clocks freeze at 9:09 for a full minute before catching up. Cell phone recorders activate on their own and capture silence, but when run through audio visualization, the waveform shows rhythm, not noise, not absence, just something held in time, like breath. One technician who analyzed the file said, "It's not silent, it's paused." Even more unsettling is what happens after the bell. People report dreams, not nightmares, not quite, but sequences too detailed to forget. Always the same setting, a chapel made of black stone surrounded by fog, where 9 caskets rest before an altar. In each dream, 8 are closed, 1 remains open. The dreamer always walks toward the 9th, and always, just before they see what's inside, they wake up, cold, breathless, with the sense that someone had just finished speaking, but they can't remember what was said. Psychologists call this a collective echo dream, a rare but documented phenomenon in communities with strong shared folklore. But in Ninewake's case, the dreamers often had no prior knowledge of the chapel. Tourists, passers-by, campers who stayed too long in the valley, people whose only mistake was being nearby when the bell remembered itself. And then there are the hymn shadows, the phenomenon where faint melodies appear not through instruments, but through actions. A woman preparing tea finds her spoon tapping the edge of her mug in perfect 3/4 time. A boy skipping stones hears the plunk of each hit match a minor key progression. A carpenter hammering nails finds he's replicating the first 4 beats of a known dirge. These moments, subtle and deniable, occur most frequently in the 9 days after the bell. Some dismiss it as coincidence. Others believe the chapel is not just a building, but an ongoing composition. One still being written, one that demands to be completed through others. People aren't haunted, They're recruited, not to enter, but to echo. In one chilling case from 2008, a postal worker named Matthew Kern disappeared after his route took him through Shallowick. His truck was found parked neatly by a ditch, the mail sorted, the door open. On the passenger seat was a cassette tape, one he never owned. It contained a single track, 9 minutes and 9 seconds of silence. When run through frequency analysis, the silence contained harmonic layering, tones inaudible to the human ear, but mathematically aligned with ancient mourning scales used in pre-Roman funeral rites. At minute 9:08, a faint sound begins, not words, but a door creaking open. Then the tape ends. The chapel, once again, had called, and someone had answered. To this day, no physical tolling mechanism has been located, no rope, no weight, no source, and yet the bell rings, not as a warning, not even as a memory, but as a placeholder, a sonic bookmark, holding the moment open for something that refuses to be forgotten. Those who hear it are marked, not visibly, not in ways that doctors can scan, but internally, like a note held long after the voice that sang it has gone. It vibrates in their dreams, in their bones, in the rhythm of their breath when they think they're alone. And perhaps that's the truest fear of Ninewake. Not that the chapel rings a bell, but that you might already be part of the song. If the chapel were just a ruin, it would have crumbled by now. If it were just a myth, it would have faded. But Ninewake remains, not as a building, not as a place, but as a structure of waiting. And what it waits for has never changed. For nearly 2 centuries, it has stood untouched, unmoved, unburied, its doors sealed, its rites incomplete, its bell ringing not as ritual, but as reminder that there is one funeral left, one casket unclosed, one name unspoken. No records exist of who the 9th funeral was for. The first 8 are written in the books, scratched into fragile ledgers that smell of mildew and dust. 8 names, 8 dates, but the 9th is always blank. The service held, the casket carried, but tossed, but no name, no family, no body, just a ceremony that completed itself, as if the act mattered more than the person, as if the chapel needed not the dead, but the gesture of death, to mark time, to keep rhythm. And ever since, it has sustained itself through fragments, a tone here, a dream there, a disappearing shadow, until someone, somewhere, finishes what was left undone. There's a growing theory now, buried in footnotes and whispered on message boards, that the chapel isn't merely holding space, it's holding place, that everything around it, the forest, the fog, the stillness, is suspended. Trapped in a kind of harmonic stasis, a moment stretched into a room made of stone and breath, a cathedral of the almost dead. And the reason the funerals failed, the reason the bodies vanished, is that Ninewake cannot let go. It holds. That's all it does. That's what it was made to do. And each September, as the bell tolls once, soft, distant, impossible, the world trembles a little, as if remembering that something beneath the soil is trying to sing. Some believe the chapel was not built by hands, that it was composed, a musical structure set into stone, that each funeral was a note, each hymn a movement, and the 9th was meant to be the final chord. But it was left unfinished, whether by accident, by resistance, or by something far older than either. And in that unfinished note, the chapel became a question the world has been trying not to answer. Because what happens when a song this old, this quiet, finally ends? There are hints here and there of what might come. During a 2021 geological survey, a drone captured a brief distortion in the tree line near the chapel's perimeter. Not a sound, not a flash, but a fold, like the image bent inward for a frame. Reviewers dismissed it as compression error, but a frame-by-frame playback revealed a dark shape in the air for a split second. No wings, no limbs, just motion, like something that had been holding its breath, exhaling once. A low-pressure dip followed. Animals fled the area, and at 9:09 p.m. that evening, the bell rang. But this time, 2 people heard it, in different towns, 5 miles apart. Both described the same word being heard after the tone: ready. Then, nothing. The chapel remains sealed. The bell remains unanswered. But the 9th space, the unburied name, still hovers. And some say it's not looking for a person, it's looking for a moment. One final act. A breath held long enough. A chord struck just right. A note forgotten too many times and finally remembered. Because if it ends, if the song is completed, then the thing that's been sustained in silence may no longer need silence. It may no longer need shadow. It may step through. You can still visit Nine Wake Chapel. The woods are quiet, the paths overgrown, the structure stands like it always has, unclaimed, unrotted, unweathered. If you bring a recording device, it won't capture anything. If you knock, no echo will return. But if you stand still long enough, you might feel a hum in your ribs. You might hear something shift behind the sealed door. And if you stay until nightfall, you might hear the bell. Only once, only faint, but deep in your bones. And if it rings for you, ask yourself one thing: are you the 9th?